In the heart of Manhattan, where ambition is currency and legacy is the ultimate prize, the Alabaster Room stood as a monument to a bygone era. It was less a restaurant and more a museum where the city's old guard came to dine, surrounded by walls paneled in imported Italian marble, and a collection of art that whispered of Gilded Age fortunes. For 22-year-old Clara Morgan, it was both a lifeline and a gilded cage. By day, Clara was a ghost, haunting the halls of Columbia University's art history department, buried in the arcane study of pigment composition and radiographic analysis of Renaissance underpaintings. By night, she wore the starched white apron of a server, her movements a silent, practiced ballet of efficiency. The job, with its grueling hours and often condescending clientele, was the penance she paid for her passion. It was the only way to afford her tiny apartment and the tuition for a degree she hoped would one day restore a name that had been dragged through the mud decades ago, her own. Clara was not just any art history student. She was the granddaughter of the late Professor Alistair Morgan, a man who had once been a titan in the field, a celebrated curator whose career had imploded in a catastrophic scandal involving a misattributed Vermeer. He had died in disgrace, his reputation shattered, leaving his family with a legacy of shame. Clara's obsession with uncovering forgeries was not merely academic. It was a deeply personal crusade to reclaim her family's honor. This knowledge, this burning secret, was the engine that drove her, a fire banked low beneath a calm, professional demeanor. Her world at the Alabaster Room was populated by a predictable cast. There was Mr. Davies, the manager, a man whose spine seemed to be made of gelatin, perpetually quivering with anxiety. He worshipped the restaurant's wealthy patrons and treated his staff as disposable, interchangeable parts of his flawless machine. Then there was Madison, a server whose 5 years of tenure had soured into a corrosive resentment for anyone younger or brighter. Madison saw Clara's quiet competence not as an asset to the team, but as a personal affront. Her help was always a prelude to sabotage, a forgotten allergy note, a misheard drink order, small, deniable acts of malice designed to make Clara stumble. Clara weathered these nightly skirmishes with a stoic grace that only seemed to fuel Madison's animosity. On this particular Thursday evening, an electric tension crackled through the restaurant. The reservation book held a name that had sent Mr. Davies into a state of near apoplexy: Elias Thorne. Clara knew the name well. In the art world, Elias Thorne was a demigod and a devil rolled into one. A German-born industrialist who had built a technology empire from scratch, Thorne was now one of the world's most formidable art collectors. His methods were as ruthless as his business tactics. He didn't just acquire art, he conquered it, using his vast fortune to outbid museums and private collectors alike. Articles in Artforum and The Collector's Quarterly described him as a man with an infallible eye and a volcanic temper, a purist who loathed mediocrity and had an almost pathological obsession with authenticity. Mr. Davies convened a frantic pre-shift meeting in the steamy confines of the kitchen. "Listen up," he hissed, his eyes darting from face to face. "Elias Thorne, table 7, 7 o'clock sharp. This is not a drill. I want perfection. Every glass polished, every syllable polite. He's a kingmaker. One bad review from him, and we might as well shut our doors." His gaze landed on Clara, a long, appraising stare. "Morgan, you're on table 7. A collective intake of breath swept through the staff. Madison shot Clara a look of pure, venomous glee mixed with a sliver of pity. Serving Thorne was the ultimate test, a public execution waiting to happen. "Sir, with all due respect, Madison has more experience with our premier clientele," Clara said, her voice a model of professional deference. It was a calculated move. She knew Davies would interpret her humility as weakness and her suggestion as a challenge to his authority. Davies' lips tightened. "My decision is final, Morgan. I want our sharpest on display tonight. Don't make me regret it." Madison smirked and turned away, polishing a spoon with theatrical intensity. The knot in Clara's stomach wasn't just fear, it was a familiar, weary resignation. This was the game she had to play to survive, to earn the tips that paid for the spectrographic analysis reports on her grandfather's disputed painting, to endure the 1,000 tiny humiliations that paved the road to her goal. She smoothed her apron, took a deep, centering breath, and prepared herself for the arrival of the king. At precisely 7 o'clock, the hushed reverence of the alabaster room was shattered by a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Elias Thorne did not simply enter, he made an incision in the room's reality. He was a man in his late 60s, carved from granite and ambition, with a shock of silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. His suit was a dark, bespoke armor of such exquisite tailoring that it made every other man in the room look like a rumpled imitation. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, his gaze sweeping the room, assessing, cataloging, and dismissing everything in a single, imperious glance. He was flanked by two younger men in expensive suits who radiated the high-frequency anxiety of those who live in the orbit of a difficult sun. They were his acolytes, a lawyer and an art advisor, their expressions a carefully balanced mixture of intelligence and terror. Mr. Davies scurried forward, his smile stretched so wide it looked painful. "Mr. Thorne, a profound honor to welcome you to the alabaster room. We are at your complete disposal." Thorne's arctic gaze flickered over Davies for a nanosecond before dismissing him. He offered no greeting, only a curt, guttural sound that conveyed his impatience. "My table," he commanded in a voice rich with a German accent, a low rumble that vibrated with absolute authority. "Of course this way, sir," Davies chirped, leading the trio to the best table in the restaurant, a corner booth upholstered in deep crimson velvet. As they were seated, Davies gestured toward Clara, who was approaching with menus. "And this is Clara, Mr. Thorne. She will be your server this evening. She is our finest." Clara offered a small professional smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome." Thorne's eyes landed on her. It was not a look, it was an appraisal, the kind a jeweler gives a stone of questionable clarity. He scanned her from head to toe, his expression one of faint, clinical disdain, before taking the menu from her hand without a word. The two men with him followed his lead, assiduously avoiding her gaze. The meal began as a masterclass in psychological attrition. Thorne treated the menu not as a list of options, but as a series of flawed propositions he was forced to endure. He interrogated Clara on the provenance of the Dover sole, the exact aging process of the beef, the mineral content of the bottled water. Each question was a barb, designed to expose a lack of knowledge, to trip her up. Clara, however, was unflappable. Her knowledge, honed by years of academic discipline, extended beyond art. She had a mind that cataloged details. "The sole is line-caught off the coast of Cornwall, sir. Brought in this morning," she answered calmly. "The beef is dry-aged for 45 days in a climate-controlled room, with Himalayan salt blocks to ensure uniform moisture reduction." Thorne grunted a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or grudging surprise, crossing his features before being suppressed. He ordered the most expensive wine on the list, a 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, and watched with the intensity of a predator as she performed the ritual of its presentation. He waved away her offer of a preliminary taste. "If it has turned, I will hold you personally responsible," he said, not as a joke, but as a threat. Throughout the meal, he kept up a running commentary of complaints. The soup was a few degrees too cool. The bread was insufficiently crusty. The string quartet in the corner was playing a Haydn piece with a sentimental and frankly offensive lack of precision. Each critique was delivered to his associates, but aimed squarely at Clara, a performance of dominance for his audience of two. Clara remained a bastion of professional serenity. She apologized sincerely, rectified every issue without fuss, and maintained a calm poise that seemed to inflame his irritation further. She felt the eyes of Mr. Davies on her from across the room, his panic radiating in waves. Madison was a circling hawk, savoring every moment of Clara's trial by fire. The climax arrived with the main courses. Thorne was in the middle of a monologue about the appalling lack of connoisseurship in modern collectors. As Clara moved to refill his water glass, a simple automatic gesture she had performed tens of thousands of times, Thorne's art advisor, in an enthusiastic gesture of agreement with his boss, bumped the table. It was a minute jolt, barely perceptible, but it was enough. A single renegade drop of water leaped from the silver pitcher's spout. It traced a perfect, glittering arc through the candlelight, and landed with infinitesimal softness on the sleeve of Elias Thorne's perfectly tailored jacket. Time seemed to congeal. Thorne stopped speaking, his fork halfway to his mouth. He slowly, deliberately placed the fork on his plate. His associates froze, their faces paling to the color of bleached bone. Across the room, Mr. Davies looked as if he had just been shot. Clara's blood ran cold. "Sir, my deepest apologies," she began, reaching for a fresh linen napkin. Thorne held up a hand, a gesture that sliced through the air and silenced her instantly. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the tiny dark speck on his sleeve, as if it were a mortal wound, a stain upon his very soul. Then, with a long, theatrical sigh of utter disgust, he turned to his companions. Confident that he was speaking a language this American girl could not possibly comprehend, he switched to his native German. His voice was no longer the low rumble of command. It was a blade honed with aristocratic contempt. "Sieh dir dieses ungeschickte Ding an," he began, the words dripping with venom. "Look at this clumsy thing. Like one of those cheap copies on the wall, she has the look of service but lacks any real substance. They hire these pretty vacant faces and expect competence. She likely possesses the intellectual depth of a puddle, utterly useless except as decoration." His two associates managed weak, sycophantic chuckles. They glanced at Clara with a renewed pity, secure in the linguistic fortress from which their master had launched his attack. They had no idea that they were standing on a landmine. For Clara, it was not just a foreign murmur. Her mother was from Heidelberg. German was the language of her childhood lullabies, the language of her first storybooks. She had spent a year studying abroad in Munich, poring over original texts by Dürer and Goethe. Every hateful syllable, every nuanced insult, landed not on deaf ears, but in a mind that understood its grammatical structure, its cultural weight, and its brutal, dehumanizing intent with devastating precision. Cheap copy, vacant. Intellectual depth of a puddle. The insult was not just cruel, it was specific. It was an assault on the very core of her being, a dismissal of the mind she had worked so hard to cultivate, a mind she believed was the only thing of value she truly possessed. It was the echo of every person who had ever looked at her and seen only a waitress. For a long, suspended moment, she stood perfectly still, the silver pitcher cool against her hand. The professional mask, her shield against the world, did not just crack, it atomized. Inside her, a lifetime of suppressed indignation, the scholarly fury of her grandfather, the quiet desperation of her own struggle, coalesced into a single point of cold, clear light. Elias Thorne finally deigned to turn his gaze back to her, expecting to see the crumbling facade of a flustered girl on the verge of tears. He was prepared to make a dismissive gesture, to send her away like a shooed fly. But that is not what he saw. He saw her posture shift. The deferential slump of the server vanished, replaced by the ramrod straight spine of an academic before a lecture hall. Her chin lifted. The polite, vacant smile was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, glacial composure. With a deliberate, unhurried movement, she placed the water pitcher on a nearby service stand. Then she met his eyes. Her gaze, which he had dismissed as merely decorative, was now alight with a fierce, analytical intelligence that seemed to pierce right through him. The change in atmosphere was so sudden, so total that the two associates fell silent, their nervous smiles dissolving. Mr. Davies, sensing a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, began to power walk toward the table, his face a rictus of panic. He was too late. Clara broke the charged silence. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a crystalline clarity that cut through the room's ambient hum. She addressed Elias Thorne directly, and she did not speak English. She spoke in flawless, academic High German, the precise, articulate dialect of scholars and intellectuals. "Herr Thorne," she began, her tone as cool and polished as the marble walls around them, "Ihre Annahme, dass meine Rolle hier ein Indikator für meinen Intellekt ist ebenso fehlerhaft wie Ihre Analyse des Gemäldes dort drüben. Sir, your assumption that my role here is an indicator of my intellect is as flawed as your analysis of the painting over there." She paused, letting the perfectly enunciated words hang in the air. Thorne's face, a moment before a mask of arrogant disdain, seemed to crumble. His mouth fell slightly agape. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a waxy, pallid sheen. His associates stared, their expressions of slack-jawed disbelief almost comical. But Clara was not finished. She gave a subtle nod toward a large oil painting hanging on the far wall, a lush 19th century landscape that was the centerpiece of the restaurant's collection. Sie bezeichneten es als eine sentimentale Kopie eines Schülers von Friedrich, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Aber wenn Sie die Pinselführung im Laubwerk genauer betrachten würden, würden Sie die für Caspar Scheuren typische Kreuzschraffur erkennen. Und das spezifische Kobaltblau am Horizont wurde erst 1868 von Thénard perfektioniert, 10 Jahre nach Friedrichs Tod. Es ist keine Kopie. Es ist ein authentisches, wenn auch geringeres Werk von Scheuren, circa 1869. Aber ich nehme an, ein Mann, der eine Kellnerin mit einer billigen Fälschung verwechselt, könnte einen solchen Fehler machen. You referred to it as a sentimental copy by a student of Friedrich. But if you were to look more closely at the brushwork in the foliage, you would recognize the cross-hatching typical of Caspar Scheuren. And that specific cobalt blue on the horizon was not perfected by Thénard until 1861, a full decade after Friedrich was dead. It is not a copy. It is an authentic, if minor, work by Scheuren, circa 1865. But I suppose a man who mistakes a waitress for a cheap forgery might make such an error. She delivered the devastating monologue without a trace of emotion. It was not an outburst. It was a dissertation. She had not merely understood his insult. She had refracted it through the prism of her own expertise, corrected his connoisseurship, dismantled his authority, and then turned his own metaphor of the cheap copy back on him with the surgical precision of a scalpel. The effect was cataclysmic. The silence that followed was a physical entity, a vacuum that sucked all the sound and air from the room. Cutlery stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. From across the dining room, Madison's jaw hung open, a half-polished fork frozen in her hand. Mr. Davies, who had been charging to the rescue, skidded to a halt a few feet away, his mind unable to process the scene. He didn't understand a word of German, but he understood the universal language of a powerful man being utterly and completely checkmated. In that moment, in the opulent heart of the alabaster room, a 22-year-old waitress held the rapt attention of New York's elite, and one of the world's most feared collectors was left staring at the wreckage of his own arrogance. The tableau held for what felt like an hour. Elias Thorne, a man who moved markets with a single phone call, was rendered immobile, his face a pale mask of shock. The intellectual trap had been sprung, and he was the one caught fast in its unforgiving jaws. His power, built on a bedrock of intimidation and the presumed ignorance of others, had been publicly demolished by a server with an encyclopedic knowledge of 19th century German Romanticism. His first instinct was a primal surge of rage. A dark, mottled flush began to creep up his neck. But the rage was instantly smothered by a more profound and alien emotion: humiliation. He had been academically disemboweled in his native tongue, in front of his own staff, by a girl he had dismissed as a piece of decorative furniture. He had tried to expose her as a forgery, only to have her prove him one. The two associates looked as if they were witnessing an act of terrifying witchcraft. They had laughed at his joke, making them complicit in his downfall. Now they looked at Clara with a kind of primal fear, as if she might suddenly reveal wings and breathe fire. It was Mr. Davies who finally shattered the stillness, rushing forward, his face slick with a desperate sweat. "Mr. Thorne, I am profoundly sorry. I have no idea what she said, but her behavior is inexcusable. It is a complete violation of our standards." "Morgan, you are—" "Schweigen Sie," Thorne snarled. "Be silent." The German words were a whip crack. Davies froze, his mouth snapping shut. Thorne's eyes had not left Clara's face. The shock was slowly being replaced by something else, something far more dangerous, a glacial, razor-sharp curiosity. This girl was an anomaly, an impossible variable in his meticulously ordered universe. He leaned forward, his voice a low, intense thrum. He switched back to German, the language of their battlefield. "Wo sind Sie?" Who are you? Clara met his stare without a tremor. She replied in the same perfect German. Ich bin Clara Morgan, Ihre Kellnerin. I am Clara Morgan, your server. The stark simplicity of her answer was another perfectly executed blow. She was not gloating or grandstanding. She was refusing to let him define her by her job while simultaneously owning it, turning his own condescension back on him. Das habe ich nicht gefragt, Thorne pressed, his voice taut. Wo haben Sie gelernt, meine Sprache zu sprechen? Wie eine Gelehrte? That is not what I asked. Where did you learn to speak my language like a scholar? He was probing now, searching for a chink in her armor. He expected to hear about a grandmother from Bavaria or a few college courses. I studied at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich for a year, Clara replied, her voice steady. My graduate thesis at Columbia is on radiographic identification of forgeries in the Northern Renaissance School, but my private passion is German Romanticism. It was my grandfather's field. She didn't offer his name. The shame was still too raw. The mention of LMU Munich, one of Germany's most prestigious universities, in a graduate thesis landed like body blows. He had just insulted a serious academic, a scholar whose knowledge in this specific area was clearly superior to his own. The irony was so dense it was almost tangible. The art advisor, Marcus, a desperate need to fix the unfixable etched on his face, cleared his throat. Sir, perhaps we should— Halt den Mann, Marcus, Thorne snapped in German. You braid like a donkey. You are as much a fool in this as I. Marcus shrank into his seat, his face burning. Thorne's attention returned to Clara. The game had irrevocably changed. This was no longer about a spilled drop of water. It was a confrontation of intellects, and he had been profoundly outmatched. For the first time in decades, Elias Thorne was intrigued. This young woman possessed a terrifying combination of knowledge, courage, and composure under fire. Such qualities were exceedingly rare. Such qualities were assets. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time, past the uniform to the formidable, analytical mind behind her calm eyes. He saw the steel in her spine, and in the cold, brutal calculus of his world, assets were to be acquired. Mr. Davies, utterly lost in the lengthy German exchange, decided he had to act. Morgan, my office, now, he hissed, grabbing Clara's upper arm. Clara winced at the bite of his fingers, but before she could speak, Thorne's voice, now in crisp, authoritative English, cut through the air. Take your hand off of her. The command was absolute. Davies snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. She is not going anywhere, Thorne continued, his gaze locked on Clara. In fact, I believe Miss Morgan and I have a great deal more to discuss. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. Please, he said to Clara, the word sounding stiff and unfamiliar on his tongue. Sit down. The command sent a fresh shockwave through the room. A billionaire collector, in the middle of a public humiliation, asking the waitress who had just eviscerated him to join his table. The rigid social architecture of the alabaster room had just been dynamited. Clara stood frozen, caught between the sputtering rage of her manager and the intense, unreadable gaze of the most formidable man she had ever met. The man who had insulted her, who had been the catalyst for this entire disaster, was now offering her a seat at the table. The night was far from over. The invitation to sit was a command cloaked in the thinnest veneer of civility. Clara looked at the crimson velvet of the offered chair, then at Elias Thorne. Her every instinct, honed by years of navigating the service industry's treacherous currents, screamed at her to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her professional role. But a deeper, more defiant impulse, the spirit of her disgraced grandfather, the scholar within her, urged her forward. He had initiated this bizarre intellectual duel. She would see it to its conclusion. With a quiet dignity that belied the frantic pounding of her heart, Clara pulled out the heavy chair and sat down. Her back was as straight as a rod of iron. Across the room, Madison watched, her face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. This was a cosmic injustice. Clara was supposed to be fired, to be leaving in tears. Instead, she was being treated like an honored guest. The injustice of it all curdled into a venomous, white-hot jealousy. You're not what you appear to be, Miss Morgan, Thorne said, his English precise and formal. Few people are, Mr. Thorne, she replied, her voice cool and even. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. Touché. Your German is academic. Your knowledge of art is clearly substantial. Why are you here, wasting your intellect serving overpriced entrees to men like me? It was the question she wrestled with every night. She gave him the unvarnished truth. Because academic grants do not cover rent in this city, and my family does not have the resources to support my studies. This is an honorable job. It funds my research. The last words were a quiet assertion of her own worth, a subtle rebuke of his earlier insult. Honor does not leverage opportunity, he countered dismissively. Intellect does. Courage does. You have demonstrated both. Those are commodities I understand, and commodities I invest in. Clara waited, her hands clasped in her lap. My personal acquisitions team is currently vetting a major collection coming up for private sale, he continued, his voice lowering conspiratorially. The Dubois collection, French Impressionism, exquisite pieces, but the provenance on several is ambiguous. My experts are divided. They are brilliant, but they are cautious. They see data, but they lack instinct. They can be fooled by a masterful forgery because they respect the technique too much. He leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze creating a palpable pressure field. I need more than an expert. I need a skeptic. I need someone who looks for the lie, not the truth. Someone with a mind that instinctively deconstructs, that sees the flaw in the brushwork, the anachronism in the pigment. I need a mind like the one that saw the truth about that worthless Shurin on the wall. The implication was as clear as it was terrifying. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was impossible. This was a dream. I am offering you a position, Miss Morgan, he said, the words falling like weights into the silent room. A trial position, to begin. You would work directly with me, as a special consultant. You would have access to my labs, my library, my entire apparatus. Your sole job would be to find the forgeries, to be my truth teller. He named a salary that made the air rush from her lungs. It was a figure so astronomical, so far beyond the scope of her reality, that it sounded like a fiction. It was student debt erasing, life-altering, family-rescuing money. It was freedom, and it was being offered by the man who, less than an hour ago, had called her a vacant, clumsy thing. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Why? She asked, her voice a near whisper. Why me? Because you are not afraid of me, Thorne stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. Everyone who works for me is afraid of me. Fear makes them cautious. It makes them predictable. They tell me what they think I want to hear. You, Miss Morgan, he said, and for the first time, his eyes seemed to be measuring not her intellect, but her soul. Told me the truth, even when it was dangerous. That quality, that intellectual ruthlessness, is rarer and more valuable to me than any masterpiece. He paused, the silence stretching taut between them. So, what is your answer? The world narrowed to the space between them, a battlefield of clinking glasses and the hushed whispers of the city's elite. Clara looked at his expectant face, at the opulent room that had been her prison, and at the impossible, gilded door he was holding open. But her mind was a maelstrom. This was not a job offer. It was an annexation. To work for this man, this arrogant, cruel, brilliant man, would be to cede some vital part of herself. To accept a future born from a moment of such profound disrespect felt like a devil's bargain, a contract signed with the ink of her own humiliation. I would need to consider it, she said, the words feeling thin and fragile in the charged air. Yet they were the truest thing she could offer. It was an act of self-preservation, a desperate claim on the autonomy he was trying to purchase. Thorne did not frown. A flicker of what might have been genuine respect, or perhaps just the satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed, passed through his cold eyes. He had expected immediate, groveling acceptance. Her hesitation, her refusal to be bought so easily, only validated his assessment of her character. She was not a sycophant. Very well, he said, His tone clipped and final. "Be at this address tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp." He slid a heavy embossed business card across the linen tablecloth. Its edges were as sharp as a blade. "We will discuss the terms of your trial. Do not be late." With that, he rose from the table, a colossus of self-possession. He threw a thick wad of $100 bills onto the table, an amount so obscene it was another form of insult, a dismissal of the value of money for those who had to count it. He strode out of the restaurant, his two chastened associates trailing in his wake like pilot fish darting around a great white shark. Clara sat alone at the table, a solitary island in a sea of staring faces. The business card felt like a hot coal in her hand, branding her with a choice she didn't want to make. The ambient noise of the restaurant rushed back in, but it was different now, curdled with speculation. Mr. Davies was hovering nearby, his face a grotesque mask of confusion and terror, as if he couldn't decide whether to fire her or promote her. But the most malevolent glare, a beam of pure, distilled hatred, came from across the room, from Madison. As Clara finally willed her legs to move, gathering herself to retreat to the relative anonymity of the kitchens, Madison intercepted her, blocking her path near the service station. Her smile was a slash of red lipstick and contempt. "Well, well," Madison hissed, her voice a low, vicious snarl that vibrated with months of pent-up resentment. "What was that little performance? The damsel in distress who speaks fluent German? How very theatrical. Tell me, what exactly did you offer him under the table to get a private meeting and his business card?" The insinuation was slimy and foul, designed to reduce Clara's intellectual triumph to the oldest, most degrading transaction. A week ago, it would have wounded her. Tonight, after the crucible of Thorne's attention, it felt like a child's tantrum. "It was a misunderstanding, Madison," Clara said, her voice weary, devoid of the energy needed for a fight. "A misunderstanding that lands you a six-figure job, I'll bet," Madison sneered, her eyes narrowing to venomous slits. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, you little bookworm, but I've been here for 5 years. 5 years of kissing ass, of smiling when I want to scream, of earning my place. I'm not letting some quiet little snake sneak in and steal what's mine." The rest of her shift was a descent into a quiet, suffocating hell. The camaraderie of the staff, fragile as it was, had evaporated. Madison had been thorough, her whispers spreading like a contagion. Clara was no longer the competent colleague. She was a connivere, a schemer who had used some unspoken feminine wile to enchant a billionaire. An order she rang in for another table was mysteriously lost in the system, earning her a sharp rebuke from Davies, who was now terrified of her and resented her for it. A tray of cocktails she was meant to deliver was accidentally jostled by Madison as they passed in the narrow hall, sending a symphony of shattering glass and expensive liquor across the marble floor. Clara realized with a sinking, leaden certainty that her life at the Alabaster Room was over. The choice Thorne had presented wasn't a choice at all. It was a foregone conclusion. Madison, consumed by a cancerous envy, had unknowingly burned the bridge behind her. The gilded cage, which had been her sanctuary and her penance, was now a hostile territory from which she had already been exiled. The path back was gone. The only way was forward into the terrifying, brilliant, and morally compromised world of Elias Thorne. The next morning, Clara stood before the Lion's Den. Thorne's headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass and steel skyscraper that seemed to sneer at the more traditional architecture of Midtown. Stepping out of the silent, high-speed elevator was like entering another dimension, one stripped of all sentimentality. The reception area was a temple of minimalist austerity, white marble floors, black leather furniture, and a single colossal Gerhard Richter painting that seemed to absorb all the light and sound in the room. Thorne did not greet her with pleasantries. He emerged from a stark white corridor, nodded curtly, and said, "Follow me." He led her past a series of glass-walled offices where severe-looking people stared intently at computer screens, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of data. The air was thin and cool, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive coffee. Finally, he pushed open a heavy steel door and gestured for her to enter a room that made the air rush from her lungs. It was not an office, but a state-of-the-art conservation and analysis laboratory. It was a scholar's paradise, a sanctuary of empirical truth. X-ray fluorescence spectrometers sat next to infrared reflectography cameras. Gas chromatographs were arrayed beside high-powered stereo microscopes. It was the kind of facility she had only read about in academic journals, a place where art was stripped of its romance and forced to confess its material secrets. "This will be your space," Thorne said, his voice flat. "My current team will resent you. They are men with doctorates from the Sorbonne and Cambridge. They will see you as an interloper, an amateur with a lucky anecdote. I expect you to prove them wrong. Your value to me is not your education, it is your skepticism. They look for reasons to believe. You must look for the reason to doubt. Your trial begins now." He led her not to a painting, but to a small framed drawing on a velvet-covered table. It depicted a writhing mass of figures, a grotesque scene of human suffering rendered in sepia ink and wash. It had the frantic, nightmarish energy of Goya. "A preparatory sketch for one of the black paintings," Thorne explained. "It surfaced from a private collection in Argentina 3 months ago. My team has authenticated the paper, which is period-correct wove paper from the early 19th century. They have analyzed the iron gall ink. Its composition is consistent with inks used by Goya's workshop. The provenance traces it back to a Spanish nobleman who fled to Buenos Aires in the 1930s. They believe it is authentic. I paid $9 million for it based on their recommendation." He paused, his gaze boring into her. "I have a feeling, a dissonance. Now tell me what you see." This was not the simple, clear-cut test she had expected. The Fragonard in her fantasy had been a simple chemical anachronism. This was different. This was a battle of connoisseurship, of intuition against data. She spent the next 3 hours with the drawing. She didn't just look at it, she interrogated it. Under the microscope, she examined the fibers of the paper, the way the ink had bled into them. She studied the line work, the confident, angry strokes that defined the figures, the delicate wash that gave them depth. Thorne sat in a leather chair in the corner of the lab, watching her, silent and unmoving as a gargoyle. She could find no scientific flaw. The materials were perfect, the technique was masterful. The provenance, while containing gaps typical for art that had crossed continents during wartime, seemed plausible. Yet Thorne's word echoed in her mind: dissonance. He had planted a seed of doubt, and she nurtured it. She stopped looking at the drawing as a whole and began to hunt for a single, discordant note. And then she found it. It wasn't in the ink or the paper. It was in the psychology of the artist's hand. In one corner of the frenzied composition, there was a small, terrified face, barely a few centimeters high. She magnified it 60 times. The lines that formed the eye were perfect, economical, but the mouth, a rictus of horror, was formed by a series of tiny, hesitant, overlapping strokes. It was a moment of uncertainty, a flicker of indecision. Goya, especially in his dark, furious later years, was never hesitant. His hand was a conduit for his rage and despair. His lines were brutal, certain, and swift. He did not stutter. She finally stepped back from the microscope, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. "My conclusion will be unpopular," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Thorne's expression did not change. "I do not pay for popularity." "The materials are authentic," she began, her voice gaining the confident cadence of a lecturer. "The paper, the ink, they are all from Goya's time. They may even have come from his workshop. But the hand that drew this is not his. It is the hand of a master draftsman, someone who studied Goya so intensely they could replicate his fury, his style, his very soul. But they are a student, a follower, not the master himself. In the mouth of this figure," she pointed, "the artist hesitated. They built up the expression of horror instead of creating it in a single, definitive stroke. Goya never hesitated. This drawing is an act of perfect mimicry, but mimicry lacks the divine certainty of creation. It is a forgery of intent, not of material, a brilliant, worthless fake." Thorne stood up and walked to the table. He picked up a magnifying glass and stared at the detail she had indicated. He looked for a long, silent minute. Then he placed the glass down, his movements precise and deliberate. He looked at Clara, and the cold, appraising look in his eyes had been replaced by something new, something that looked almost like hunger. My entire team of experts missed it, he said softly, a statement of fact that carried the weight of a death sentence for their careers. They were seduced by the data. They saw the correct pigments and the correct paper, and they stopped thinking. You, you saw the ghost in the machine. He gave a single sharp nod. The trial is over. The position is yours. Your first assignment will be to compile a dossier on the auction house and the Argentine family who sold me this. I want to know everything. And when you are done, you will help me dismantle them, piece by piece. The months that followed were a whirlwind of discovery and moral compromise. Working for Elias Thorne was like holding on to the tail of a comet. He was a demanding, often tyrannical mentor. He pushed Clara harder than she had ever been pushed, challenging her assumptions, forcing her to defend every conclusion with irrefutable evidence. Their relationship was not one of friendship, but of a fierce, combative, intellectual respect. It was exhilarating and terrifying. She was no longer a ghost in a university library. She was a hunter, and the world of art was her hunting ground. But there was a darkness to it. She saw how Thorne used information as a weapon, how he leveraged an artwork's questionable provenance to ruin a rival collector, or acquired a masterpiece from a desperate family for a fraction of its worth. He was teaching her to see the art world not as a cathedral of beauty, but as a marketplace of vanity, greed, and secrets. She was becoming colder, more clinical. The part of her that had fallen in love with the human stories behind the canvases was being systematically starved, replaced by a ruthless connoisseurship that mirrored her employers. It was this growing sense of unease that drove her, late one night, into Thorne's private digital archives. It was a fortress of information, a library of every major auction catalog, academic journal, and provenance record from the last century. Her official task was to research a disputed Matisse, but her fingers, seemingly with a will of their own, typed in a different search term: Alistair Morgan. The file that appeared was thin, a few academic papers, followed by the flurry of articles from the 1960s detailing his catastrophic fall from grace over the misattributed Vermeer. She read them again, the words that had been the foundational text of her family's shame. But now she read them with new eyes, Thorne's eyes. She wasn't reading for narrative. She was hunting for dissonance. She cross-referenced the names: the anonymous Swiss dealer who had provided the damning evidence, the small private auction house that had handled the initial sale, the art critic who had written the most scathing denunciation. She started building a web, a network of connections, using the same relentless methodology Thorne had taught her. She worked in secret, for hours after everyone else had gone home, the glow of the monitor her only companion. She felt a profound sense of trespass, of using her master's weapons for her own private war. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: a digitized record of shipping manifest from the port of Antwerp in 1968. She found a consignment of antique furniture shipped from the Swiss dealer, a man named Jean-Luc Bisset, to a holding company in New York. The holding company, after a dozen more hours of digging through shell corporations, turned out to be owned by the family of the art critic who had crucified her grandfather in the press. It was a thread, a tiny, rotten thread. With Thorne's immense resources now being secretly bent to her will, she pulled on it. She found financial records, old letters, and finally, the smoking gun, buried in the archived correspondence of Bisset's now-defunct gallery. It was a note, not a confession, but a boast written to an associate. It detailed how they had used the arrogant Professor Morgan's unimpeachable reputation to authenticate their master forger's Vermeer, and then, once the painting's value was established, they had engineered his disgrace to bury the trail and eliminate the one man who might, upon reflection, uncover the fraud. It wasn't a mistake. It was a murder of a reputation. Her grandfather hadn't been a fool. He had been a tool, and then a target. She sat back in Thorne's leather chair, the evidence glowing on the screen in the silent, empty office. She felt no elation, only a profound, hollow ache. The truth had not set her free. It had simply shown her the precise architecture of her family's prison. She had the proof, but what could she do? To reveal it would be to reveal her deception, her secret war conducted within the walls of his empire. The next morning she walked into Thorne's office, printed the entire dossier, and placed it on his desk without a word. She would not lie. She would face the consequences. He spent an hour reading, his face an unreadable granite mask. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper. When he was finished, he carefully squared the pages into a neat pile. He looked up at her, and his eyes were not angry. They were alight with a terrifying predatory glee. "Superb," he said, the word a low growl of appreciation. "You used my resources, behind my back, to conduct a personal vendetta. You moved with stealth, precision, and absolute ruthlessness. You did not come to me for help. You came to me with a victory." He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "This is no longer your private matter, Miss Morgan. This Basset and his associates, they created a forgery that fooled the world. They built a lie that endured for half a century. This is not about justice." He turned back to her. "This is about connoisseurship. They insulted the very fabric of our world, and we are going to make them pay for it." The scandal, when Thorne finally unleashed it, was seismic. He didn't leak it to a newspaper. He convened a private symposium of museum directors, art historians, and the heads of the world's most powerful auction houses. He presented Clara's evidence not as a plea for her grandfather's reputation, but as a cold, hard case study in the vulnerability of their shared world. The collapse of the Geneva Syndicate was total, and the art world was thrown into a decade of panicked reevaluation. The Art Historian's Review, the same journal that had published the articles that destroyed her grandfather's career, ran a full-length cover story. Alistair Morgan, vindicated. They published the evidence Clara had uncovered, posthumously restoring his name. A year later, Clara returned to the alabaster room. She did not wear an apron. She wore a tailored silk dress the color of midnight, and she walked not to the service station, but to the best table in the house, the corner booth upholstered in crimson velvet. Elias Thorne was already waiting for her, a bottle of 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild breathing on the table between them. She saw Mr. Davies scuttling by, his spine still made of gelatin. He met her eyes for a fleeting second, a look of pure, unadulterated terror passing over his face before he scurried away. In the distance, she saw Madison, her face a little harder, her movements a little slower, still polishing silverware, still trapped in the same bitter loop. Madison looked up, saw Clara, and for a moment, her mask of resentment fell away, revealing a vast emptiness beneath. Then the mask was back, and she turned away. Clara felt no triumph, only a distant clinical pity. "A sentimental journey?" Thorne asked, pouring her a glass of the wine. "A final accounting," Clara replied, taking the glass. The wine was perfect. They talked business for 2 hours. They were no longer mentor and student, but partners. She had her own team now, her own projects. She had become as sharp, as ruthless, and as respected as he was. She had reclaimed her family's honor, but she knew with a certainty that was both chilling and liberating that she had sacrificed a part of her softer self to do it. The girl who had studied art for its beauty was gone, replaced by a woman who studied it for its truth, and its truth was often a weapon. As the evening ended, Thorne looked at her across the table, his eyes catching the candlelight. "I was wrong about you that first night, Miss Morgan," he said. "Oh," she asked, an eyebrow raised. "I called you a cheap copy. In truth, you are an old master, rediscovered." Clara smiled, a slow, knowing smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "You're wrong again, Elias," she said, her voice a low, confident purr. She had never used his first name before. "I am not a rediscovery." She leaned forward, her gaze as direct and piercing as his had once been. "I am a new acquisition, and my provenance is entirely my own.